It was a serene and beautiful evening, with the sun beginning its descent, casting a golden hue across the horizon. Chief Louis, a prominent and well-respected figure, was driving along a secluded road, enjoying the calm after a long day. However, his peace was short-lived. His car, a luxurious black sedan, suddenly sputtered and came to a halt in the middle of nowhere. The engine had failed him, and he found himself stranded on a lonely, desolate stretch of road. Frustrated and unsure of what to do, Chief Louis stepped out of the vehicle to assess the situation. As he stood there, contemplating his next move, a group of rough-looking men approached. Their disheveled appearance and menacing demeanor were enough to raise alarm bells in his mind. These were local touts, notorious in the area for preying on unsuspecting travelers. They feigned concern, pretending they wanted to help fix his car, but their true intentions were far from noble. The touts closed in on Chief Louis, their eyes gleaming with greed. They saw an opportunity to extort money and steal his valuables, knowing he was isolated and vulnerable. Chief Louis could sense the danger, but there was little he could do. Just when things seemed to be taking a turn for the worse, a young man named Ken appeared. Ken was a striking figure, tall, handsome, and with a sharp look in his eyes. He had been passing by when he noticed the situation unfolding and instinctively knew he had to intervene. Without hesitation, Ken stepped in, placing himself between Chief Louis and the touts. "Hey, back off!" Ken's voice was firm and commanding, his posture fearless. The touts, taken aback by his boldness, hesitated. There was something about Ken's presence that made them reconsider their actions. After a tense standoff, they retreated, fleeing the scene without further incident. However, in the commotion, Ken had injured himself, a deep cut on his arm from a broken bottle one of the touts had wielded. Chief Louis, relieved and grateful, insisted on taking Ken to the hospital. He couldn't believe how this stranger had put himself at risk to protect him. The following day, Chief Louis visited Ken in the hospital to express his gratitude. "I owe you my life," he said sincerely. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." Ken smiled modestly. "I just did what anyone would do," he replied, brushing off the praise. But Chief Louis knew better. Ken had gone above and beyond. As the day of Ken's discharge approached, Chief Louis took the opportunity to learn more about him. "So Ken, what do you do for a living? Where do you stay?" he asked, curious about the man who had saved him. Ken hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm homeless," he admitted. "I sleep in front of shops at the market, wherever I can find space." There was no trace of self-pity in his voice, only a resigned acceptance of his situation. Chief Louis was taken aback. "Do you have any qualifications?" he asked. Ken nodded. "Yes, I'm a graduate, but I've been out of work for a while now. The job market's tough, and I've had no luck finding anything." Chief Louis thought for a moment. Here was a capable, educated young man who had saved his life, yet he was living in such dire conditions. An idea formed in his mind. "Ken, how about this? You come stay with me. I need someone trustworthy to help around the house, and I have space in the boys' quarters. You'll have a roof over your head, and you won't have to worry about food or a place to sleep." Ken's eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Chief. I don't know how to repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Chief Louis said with a smile. "Consider it a small token of my appreciation." Ken moved into Chief Louis's home the next day. His primary duties were to keep watch over the house, wash the cars, and run errands. One morning, as he was scrubbing down one of the cars in the driveway, Amaka, the cook, approached with a tray of food. "Ken, here's your breakfast," she said, offering him a warm smile. Ken wiped his hands on a rag and smiled back. "Thank you, Amaka. Just leave it there. I'll eat when I'm done." They chatted for a bit, sharing stories about their lives and jobs. There was a clear bond between them, a friendship that felt comfortable and natural. Amaka, with her cheerful demeanor and warm heart, found herself drawn to Ken. But Ken remained focused on his work. He had no intention of getting involved with anyone in the household, especially not with Chief Louis's cook. He knew better than to blur the lines between personal and professional. Later that afternoon, Ken was resting in the shade when Tonia, Chief Louis's daughter, approached him. She was a striking young woman with an air of confidence that matched her beauty. "Ken, can you help me get some groceries for my mom?" she asked, flashing him a sweet smile. Ken agreed and hurried off to the store. When he returned with the groceries, he handed them to Mrs. Lillian, Chief Lewis's wife, who was seated in the living room. As he passed the bags to her, Mrs. Lillian gently grasped his hand, holding it longer than necessary. Her touch lingered, and the look in her eyes was unmistakable. There was something more behind that gesture. Ken quickly pulled his hand away, his heart racing. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered, retreating hastily from the room. His mind was spinning. In just a few days, both Amaka and Tonya had shown interest in him, and now Mrs. Lillian too? He couldn't understand why this was happening, but one thing was clear: he needed to be very careful. As Ken returned to his quarters, he pondered the situation. He had come into this household to work and live in peace, but now it seemed that there were complications he hadn't anticipated. With Chief Lewis's maid, daughter, and wife all vying for his attention, Ken knew he had to tread carefully. Staying focused on his job and avoiding any entanglements was the only way to ensure he didn't offend the chief or lose the opportunity that had been so graciously given to him. But with temptation lurking at every corner, Ken realized that keeping his distance would be more challenging than he had ever imagined. Few days after settling into his new role, Ken was in his apartment when Mrs. Lillian knocked on the door, holding a heap of laundry for him to wash. Without hesitation, Ken took the clothes from her, but as he did, a delicate piece of her underwear slipped from the pile and fell to the floor. Embarrassed, Ken quickly bent down to pick it up. However, Mrs. Lillian took advantage of the situation and leaned in closer, her intentions clear as she tried to seduce him. "Come on, Ken," she purred, her voice sultry. "No one will know. It'll be our little secret." Ken, feeling trapped, immediately stepped back. "I can't, ma'am," he replied firmly, his voice steady. "I respect Chief Lewis too much." Mrs. Lillian's demeanor changed in an instant. Her eyes darkened with fury, and she crossed her arms. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I have the power to sack you, and I will if you don't learn your place." Shaken by the encounter, Ken knew he had to tread carefully. He quickly left the room, determined to avoid any further confrontations with Mrs. Lillian. But her threat lingered in his mind. That evening, as Chief Lewis and Mrs. Lillian were chatting in their bedroom, she pressed the issue. "Lewis, you need to fire Ken. He's incompetent and lazy. I don't think he's good for this household," she insisted. Chief Lewis, however, was skeptical. He had seen Ken's hard work and dedication since the young man had joined them. "I don't understand, Lillian. Ken has been nothing but helpful. He's been through a lot, and we're giving him a chance to rebuild his life. He's an orphan, after all." Mrs. Lillian bit her tongue, realizing that her attempts to manipulate Chief Lewis weren't working. She needed another plan. The next day, Ken sat in front of the compound, lost in thought about the temptations surrounding him. Mrs. Lillian, Amaka, and even Tonya, who seemed to undress him with her eyes at every opportunity. He was torn, knowing that succumbing to any of these advances would not only jeopardize his job, but also his integrity. Suddenly, an elegant woman approached the gate. She carried herself with grace and confidence, and her attire suggested she was someone important. "Is Chief Louis home?" she asked. Ken stood up and replied, "No, ma'am. He's out at the moment." The woman smiled politely. "I'm Kamsi, Chief's first daughter from his late wife. I just arrived from abroad." Ken quickly opened the gate for her, helping her park her car and carry her bags into the house. There was something different about Kamsi, an air of sophistication and kindness that set her apart from Mrs. Lillian and Tonya. The following day, Ken and Kamsi found themselves chatting in the garden. She shared stories of her childhood in the house and the circumstances that led her to leave after her mother's passing. "I couldn't stay here after my mom died, especially when Lillian moved in," Kamsi confided. "It didn't feel like home anymore." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Lillian, who appeared at the doorway, her expression sour and filled with jealousy. She barked an unreasonable errand at Ken, clearly trying to spite Kamsi. "Ken, go to the market and get me some things. Now." Ken, knowing it was a petty request, tried to refuse. "Ma'am, it's getting late. Can't it wait until tomorrow?" But Mrs. Lillian wouldn't hear of it. "Now, Ken." Kamsi, sensing the tension, stood up. "I'll go with you," she said, much to Ken's surprise. "No, ma'am, I can manage," Ken insisted, worried about what people would think if the daughter of a wealthy man was seen with him on such a menial errand. But Kamsi wasn't the type to care about appearances. "I don't mind," she said, brushing off his concerns. This left Ken both puzzled and intrigued. Why was Kamsi being so close to him, despite their difference in status? One fateful morning, while Ken was washing Chief Lewis's car, he overheard a disturbing conversation between Mrs. Lillian and Tonia in the kitchen. He listened as Mrs. Lillian laid out a chilling plan. "You need to be ready to take over everything, Tonia," Mrs. Lillian whispered. "Kamsi is a threat. We'll get rid of her, and then you'll inherit all of Chief's wealth." Tonia, looking unsure, asked, "But how? What if Chief finds out?" Mrs. Lillian smirked. "He won't. And remember, Tonia, Chief isn't even your real father. You deserve this." Ken's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Mrs. Lillian was plotting to eliminate Kamsi, and Tonia wasn't even Chief Lewis's biological daughter. He knew he had to act fast. That afternoon, Ken approached Chief Lewis in private and revealed everything. He also presented a secret recording he had made of Mrs. Lillian's incriminating conversation. Chief Lewis was devastated, but knew he had to handle the situation carefully. The next day, Chief Lewis, holding the results of a DNA test he had conducted on Tonia, confronted Mrs. Lillian. "I know everything," he said coldly. "Your lies, your betrayal. Pack your things and leave my house, both you and Tonia." Mrs. Lillian's face went pale as she realized her game was up. She and Tonia were promptly sent away, leaving Ken and Chief Lewis to reflect on the close call. "Once again, Ken, you've saved my life," Chief Lewis said gratefully. "And this time, it's my family's legacy you've protected." In appreciation, Chief Lewis promoted Ken to the manager of his company, recognizing not only his loyalty, but also his integrity. One evening, while the household enjoyed a quiet dinner, Chief Lewis noticed something. Ken was gazing at Kamsi with admiration, his eyes lingering on her in a way that hadn't gone unnoticed. Chief cleared his throat and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Later, when they were alone, Chief Lewis teased Ken. "I've seen the way you look at my daughter. Is there something you're not telling me?" Ken blushed, his face reddening. I do like Kamsi, sir." Chief Lewis chuckled and placed a hand on Ken's shoulder. "If you like her, then you know what to do. You have my blessing." Ken's heart soared with joy. In the months that followed, he and Kamsi grew closer, their bond deepening with each passing day. Eventually, they married, and Ken, the once homeless young man who had saved Chief Lewis's life, became a beloved son-in-law and an integral part of the family. Together, Ken and Kamsi lived happily ever after, proving that sometimes good deeds truly do lead to great rewards. Thank you for watching. Please drop a like or comment if you enjoyed this movie storyline, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting movie storylines. See you in our next episode.